Greetings everyone, my name is Buck Business, and this is the countdown of both mine and Kawhi's worst 3 episodes of My Little Pony Season 7. These are the episodes we thought were the worst, or most disappointing, or most boring of this season. So, with that being said, I'm pretty sure at least one of these will probably be a bit surprising, but with our reasonings, or at least mine, I hope I can conclude why these are my picks. With that said, of course, as I probably already mentioned, but we'll do so again just in case, these are our opinions, and so on and so forth. So with that being said, let us get on with the countdown, shall we? The third worst episode is... Not Asking for Trouble is quite a mess of an episode, which is why it ended up on the number 3 spot, as it diverges expectations in the wrong way, as the potential of a story is completely ruined here, subverting to something we've seen done before, and done better, quite frankly. In this episode, it begins quite bland, as Pinky's antics aren't all that interesting at the beginning, and all of the traditions of the acts is just played off as some sort of short-sighted, not well thought through process. And that is probably the most disappointing part about this episode. And the way it handles getting to the problem is also really poorly handled. It just sort of seems to happen almost out of nowhere, and there's no follow-through, and it just makes the pacing feel uncomfortably rushed. Furthermore, the rest of the episode just makes everything else confusing, with the main yak and his process of thinking, and how the other yaks respond to this. It just doesn't feel right, and the end of the episode is even more so baffling because of this process. It just didn't add up, and it left a poor taste at the end of the day, and that is why Not Asking for Trouble is the third worst episode of Season 7. And the second worst episode is... Shuttle Play Part 1 and 2 is an unfortunate ending to Season 7, as it just comes off as incredibly disappointing. The legends they built up felt completely ruined, at least some of them did, in this episode, and it just came off as baffling. Just an example, Miss Maine's story is completely ruined by this episode, and it makes no sense. On top of that, the main villain of this isn't really all that interesting. He just comes off as a more generic, cliche villain that we've seen time and time again. He's not unique, and nor is his design. And the only reason I didn't pick this as the worst episode, or episodes that I'm putting together, is only because of the ending. I do appreciate the ending of this episode, both me and Kawhi Critic, but the process of getting there was just not worth it. They didn't properly place everything and needed more time to flesh out this character, on top of doing everything else correctly. I mean, the way that Twilight Sparkle behaves in this episode is a head-scratcher to say the very least, and it just comes off as completely puzzling. Other than that, it's just sort of not that interesting. Following all of these characters, and sure, they get their little lines here and there, but overall, it just comes off as poor taste, and a lot of bad decisions just to come to a pretty interesting conclusion, but again, to get there, it felt like there was almost a sacrifice in story in order to get that good ending, and that's why This is the second worst episode of Season 7. And the worst episode this season is... A Royal Problem is, in my opinion, the worst episode in Season 7. I actually agree with Lily Pete on this one. The hype train behind this episode was way blown out of proportion, and for no good reason. This episode could have actually worked, but it ended up being one of the most disappointing episodes I've ever seen on this show. And it primarily faults Starlight Glimmer. Now, here's the thing about me and Kawaii Critic. We both have a foundation, a sort of built ideology, if you will, that it's okay to give new characters in a show a chance. That is one of our channel's monikers, is that we love to give new things a chance. And that's what we were willing to do with Starlight, and it seemed like her progression through the episodes beforehand were sort of leading to an actual interesting follow-through story progression, an actual arc that makes sense and is followed through really well. But a Royal Problem came out, and it turned Starlight Glimmer a complete 180 from where she was going, and made her magic instantly be the solution to the problem rather than be just another issue as it has been in the past. And it just comes off as it's completely luck. And that just feels completely wrong in every sense of the way. It would have been a much more interesting progression if she started to slowly stop using magic first, and realizing she could solve problems without using magic. And in fact, that probably also would have helped the Season 7 finale if Starlight Glimmer did exactly what she did, but was able to pull Stygian out without using magic. I think that would have helped the Season 7 finale just a bit, but not fix it from being the second worst episode. Furthermore, not only that, the first half of this episode is completely boring. And that's just not very interesting. I'm sorry, but Celestia's job is boring, and sure, you can argue that that's sort of the point, is that Luna's supposed to be bored, but making us bored as audience members doesn't really do anything for us as audience members. It just leaves us bored. And yes, I have a solution that could have fixed this entire episode, but I'll get to that later. Let's talk about Sunbreaker and how it's just a teaser. It is just this quick, oh, here's this thing for one episode, one quick moment, and just have her go poof, out of existence, but it was all within a dream, so it didn't really matter. The stakes weren't there. There were no stakes whatsoever. It didn't matter to anything or anyone. At least that's what it felt like, and it just felt so wrong. So the only interesting element is perhaps Luna's nightmare, but that's been done before and better in her own episode. So, to say that that part's even really that great is stretching at this point. Overall, all of this episode is just a huge disappointment. And here's how I think this episode should have been fixed. Let's say, for example, this episode were to come out earlier in one of the earlier seasons. That would have justified the sort of argument mentality these two have toward each other a little bit more than as it is now. Furthermore, it would have been more interesting, at least for me, if it had been Twilight had to be the one to learn to be more aggressive toward the princesses. Don't you think that lesson would have made a bit more sense? I mean, she technically hasn't learned to do that yet, and it would have been an interesting lesson to have tackled back then. But now, with Starlight Glimmer, it just feels like it's completely 100% luck. And that isn't necessarily a great lesson. Just luck? Really? That is the lesson you're trying to pull here. There's no other way around it, really. At least in my opinion. So, here's how we fix it if it was in Season 7. Have Celestia and Luna actually getting along, and have Luna actually learn about Celestia's duties instead of having them forcing to switch places at the beginning of the episodes. Second, make one of Celestia's job a lot more interesting. Let's say one of her jobs included protecting Tartarus, the place where she drove off all the past villains, or at least some of them, or at least one of them. Have that be one of her tasks, and have that be the introduction of Sunbreaker. Have Sunbreaker somehow be inside of that. I know that would have had to have been explained, but I'm not saying my idea is perfect, but still, I think having her introduced earlier in this episode would have helped this episode build up that side character and have her actually be in the real world sooner and have it actually be a real threat as she comes out and Celestia's magic isn't good enough because it is her magic that is fueling this Sunbreaker. So perhaps it is up to Luna to step up and help her sister, or something along those lines. I'm not sure how I would have ended the episode, but that is the sort of general direction I would have taken this episode to help build Sunbreaker in a way that just feels a lot better. And you could have had action that had actual stakes, and you could have had the characters still pretty much doing what they were doing, with the exception of Starlight. She could have still been in the episode, but just have her learning from the princesses about their duties or something, I don't know. It's anything but this. This was just a disaster of an episode, and it just left a bad taste in my mouth. And that is why it is the worst episode of Season 7, in my opinion. So, those were the top worst episodes of the season. My name is Buck Business, and if you somehow enjoyed this video, please feel free to like, comment, and subscribe. Until next time, everyone, farewell!